if I can invite you guys to move up to the room that we set up for you, we'll just get it going in there, I suppose.
All right, I'm gonna go take a piss first.
Yeah, okay, that's fine, no problem. Right, we are here. ThoughtBat, you want to do a quick mic check while he's
Blah blah.
okay? You're working. I'll just move him up here. Right, he's in. I'll unmute him. There you go. He can talk on everyone's. So yeah, in the interim, like I say, we are recording. You're gonna have a discussion about mutualism versus capitalism, and this might just be part one.
So, anyways, I've got my personal statement, my opening statement ready. It's a bit of a short one, a bit hashed out because obviously we have a little bit less time. But
Yeah, I was going to ask you how long is it, because if it's like half hour long, then he's not going to be able to respond, because I don't think he's got very long. But
it's 700 words long.
700 words.
Just
Yeah, it's like 2 paragraphs. It's not that long at all. Like it's
just start.
it'd probably be like 1 minute.
I
Anyways, okay.
Neolib is here, but he cannot mic for a second. And
Right.
he left.
He's left. Right.
Yeah, well, there's no point in you reading it if he's not here to listen to it. Cause I think maybe it's just like maybe he pressed the wrong button or something. But let's just give him a minute or two. Because if you read it at me, then I'm just gonna be like, okay, cool, like whatever.
Stop the recording, delete it, and start the another one when because we will have like 10 minutes of.
Yeah, I can stop the recording and start it again. That's fine. It's no problem. Is that him back?
Yep.
Yeah, that is
Yeah,
him back.
it is. Okay, I'm not going to do that then. Right, it's going to continue. Let me have a look. Is he able to speak? Neolib, you here?
Yes.
Okay, right. We are recording. This is the go time. I think ThoughtBat wants to start.
Okie dokie. So, good evening. If I were to ask you a simple question, such as, should we keep the ownership of people abolished? I have no doubt that we'd each say yes, unquestionably. We'd be so confident in our answer for 2 key reasons. The concept of slavery is widely considered to be deeply immoral, and in the West, slavery has been abolished since various points in the 1800s, depending on which Western country you reside in. Just under 200 years or so onwards, we were very used to a world without slavery, and the thought of bringing it back as a legal institution would make the skin crawl. However, this was not the case prior to the 1800s. Prior to the 1800s, there was a great fear across Europe and its colonial empires about what the abolition of slavery would lead to. So much fear, in fact, the abolitionist sentiment developing in Great Britain in the 1700s has been cited as a contributing factor towards many people in the South of the 13 colonies choosing to rebel against the British Empire in favour of the independence of a new slave-owning nation. Fears that slaves might compete with wage workers and undercut their wages, or be left to live less fulfilling lives than they did as slaves, or the price shocks that may result from cotton picking becoming work which needed to be compensated, effectively led to a great many people to wondering whether or not abolishing a property right could possibly economically work. Well, as we know, since the abolition of slavery, all of these concerns have been addressed thanks to the capacity of humans to accept new challenges and work out solutions to them. And they have been addressed, and now we live in a society where the lack of slavery is not a hindrance on our lives. Another component of historical economies, which people were concerned whether or not a society could do or do without, was of course the monarchy. The only way we can know if a new society can work is simply by making it work. That has been the general lesson of human history with regards to political progress. So those are just the quick comments I wanted to make on that. So another component I call into question is simply property. Well, more precisely, absentee property. Property which is owned by someone who does not use it, but sets conditions for use by other people. Examples of such property would include rented housing and privately owned corporations. So what's the big deal? Well, property is merely a means of resource distribution in a world of scarce resources. So, is that unreasonable? It's certainly reasonable, and I'm no critic of all property. But we need to remember that property is itself a claim to authority about what may be done about a given object or piece of land, which is important because every individual needs to use and manipulate land and objects in order to live. As Rothbard quite correctly pointed out, property rights are the source of all other human rights. Take any well-respected human right, the right to free speech, for example. That basically says I have the right to say anything I want. Most people are in favour of this right as it's important for people to be able to criticise and discuss the political state of things for a democracy to function. However, in order to speak so that people can hear me, probably the most useful thing, I need a platform. So unless I wish to preach to people in the comfort of my own living room, it's very likely I'm going to need to use a lecture room or some television studio or whatever, which is very likely to be owned by someone else. So before I step onto that property, I may only do so by respecting the conditions of being let onto that property. The owner necessarily arbitrates what I can and cannot say whilst on their property. So he'll say, yes, you can use my megaphone or my broadcasting station, my YouTube channel, so long as you don't say X, Y, or Z. So I don't really have a right to free speech if I do not own the property I'm using to speak. I can only truly say what I want to say, that is, access my right to free speech, if I own the platform. So now we can see that human rights themselves are dependent on property rights. Here's the issue. The French philosopher P.J. Proudhon noted this in his critique of property and argued that the fact that human rights may be trumped by property means that people who do not own property, so i.e. renters who work for a boss, simply do not have access to their rights that liberalism declared were inalienable to man. So the alternative, and I'm going off the script now, the alternative is some kind of usufruct property whereby people own the objects that they directly use. So people own the houses that they live in and people own the workplaces where they work at. That is considered to be the ideal means of organizing a society back on those kind of libertarian terms. And that's pretty much what I'm arguing for. That wasn't my best opening statement, I know, but that was hashed together in such little amount of time. I'll just work with that for now. We'll go from there.
Thank you. ThoughtBat, Neolib, you have the floor.
I do not have an opening statement or anything. We can just get talking about it.
Sure, start. It's your turn to talk.
Okay. I think my main issue that I had with ThoughtBat's criticism about my position is specifically the claim that my position was paradoxical. And ThoughtBat, could you explain to me like why my position would be paradoxical in terms of sort of like the kind of that I think society should have some evidence?
Can you just sum up your position for us who did not follow your previous discussions in like 5 minutes, if that's not a problem?
Sure. My position is that we should probably establish societies and economic systems based off of some evidence-based, like empiricism. And rather than just sort of like throwing away capitalism, I think we should probably just slowly improve it. And my main criticism of mutualism was that ThoughtBat specifically said that mutualism would be the most pragmatic economic system to establish in terms of like maximizing democracy. But I kind of take issue with the term pragmatic because pragmatic usually refers to some real world conditions. And I don't think mutualism has really, we haven't really demonstrated that mutualism is pragmatic in any sense at all. And at that point is where ThoughtBat, I don't want to like mischaracterize, would say that my view of this is paradoxical because then no society would ever be able to be proved, or there would never be evidence for a society or any improvement on society, which that is what I mainly take issue with.
So the accusation of paradoxical thinking would have been the fact that you currently advocate a system which you think is justified and should be maintained, whilst saying that the standards for justification are necessarily going to be rooted in some kind of empiricism. Now, the thing is, you're an American, I assume, and you live in a society which was produced by a group of people getting together and throwing away the establishment that they lived under without any empirical evidence that their system would work. in the new world or given the conditions of the day. So they didn't do the sort of the empirical research that you prescribe society should do in order to be set up, yet you defend that system anyway. Now, another problem with that is that you don't know yourself that that system is the best system possible. So why would you therefore claim to support it? Because without the empirical research done on every single ideology known to man, how can you choose one? You've just all you've done is you've chosen one which currently exists. And well, I'm not too sure why you've done that. You can't say it's because it's been empirically proven to be better than others, because we haven't done the research, we haven't done the tests. All we can say about this present society is that it currently exists, it currently functions. That's all we can say. Now, that tells us nothing about whether or not it should remain so.
Yeah, my position on capitalism is not that I'm necessarily married to it. The reason why I like it is because when I say that it's sort of proven, I mean that there are certain ends that I want to see a society be able to meet certain measures, and capitalism is the one that seems to best meet those. Now, I'm open to sort of like capitalism being replaced if we can find, another system that would be able to best meet those measures that I like. But for example, some of the measures would be I like people being able to have a choice between sort of like what they want to do, which would be sort of employment. Another one would be people being able to have creative expression. So things like music, being able to choose from different music, being able to choose different forms of art, consumption and all that. Relatively stable society, so you're not in fear of violence or death. Health, so pretty good health measures, food, shelter, stuff like that. So if there was a system that would be proven to be better than capitalism in these regards, then obviously I would want to choose that one. So that's how I feel about capitalism. It's not sort of like some arbitrary position that I have. That's just how I feel about it. And so when it comes to society, capitalism was not established through empiricism. Yeah, that's true. I just don't think that because we haven't established societies in the past using empiricism doesn't mean we shouldn't do that from here on out. So I don't think
we can't do that. We can't
do that.
We can't run like nationwide experiments of entire ideologies, can we? It
No,
just doesn't work like that.
Not nationwide, but you could probably do it like at the state level, city level, something like that. Like I don't think you have like obviously you can't prove that it works nationwide before establishing it nationwide, but you would want to have reasonable experiments that you can set up where you can reasonably extrapolate that it would work nationwide.
Well, okay. So at the moment, what we have for mutualism is the cooperative sector, and the cooperative sector has plenty of research behind it saying that it produces pretty nice outcomes for the people that work in it, pretty nice outcomes for consumers of cooperatives. They're generally more environmentally friendly. Housing cooperatives have provided a nice alternative to landlording, I guess, renting. And healthcare cooperatives have also provided a nice third way alternative to between like private insurance and state provided insurance. And another one was mutual banking, which is they themselves have relatively low interest rates. We have got the empirical research to say that the building blocks of a mutualist society. A mutualist society is basically just a society where mutualist institutions are the dominant form, right? So a capitalist society is a society whereby capitalist institutions are the dominant form of doing things. So if I can say, look, cooperatives are themselves viable means of doing things, I think I am probably saying something that may or may not be true. But when I use the term pragmatic, I might have been comparing mutualism to communism, as in whenever anarcho-communism seems to come about, it always seems to degenerate back into mutualism, as in markets seem to creep back into any kind of anarchist communist society. That may not have been the case, but that's pretty much the only time today, regardless of what I may have said a few weeks ago, today that I'd say about pragmatism and mutualism. I'd just say, look, it seems that mutualism is far more workable than anarcho-communism. That's about it. But cooperatives do provide pretty nice, viable alternatives to the capitalist business model. Even, and we've known this for quite a while. Even Marx pointed them out and said, "Look, these are pretty nifty." Now, in terms of getting a statewide or citywide experiment, that is a very lofty expectation to hoist on the mutualist, because you're effectively asking the mutualist to then ask the government to run an experiment to try and prove whether or not the government itself is a necessary institution for existence. So I'm effectively questioning the legitimacy of the state and obviously its capitalist beneficiaries. So they're never going to do that. They're never going to say, okay, let's just have New York be a mutual society and see how it works. Because governments don't do that. Governments are pretty much, as institutions, they just want to maintain the status quo, or maintain or further the quote unquote will of the people. That's all they do. They just consolidate the status quo. They don't have a habit of massive social experimentations to prove this or that system right or wrong.
Yeah, I would say that'd be the main feature of the society that I want, and sort of like the state system that I would want. I think if you were to say that that you don't think it's possible for the state to ever establish any kind of like even citywide experiments, it sort of seems like you're saying that the only way to get it would just be to start off right off the bat with mutualism. But if you're not going to get it to the state, then I'm imagining you believe that your system can only be established through revolution.
No, I don't. I think my system can be established through gradualism.
Okay, what do you mean by gradualism?
So gradualism is whereby the cooperative sector effectively eclipses the private sector through varying means, both non-violent and violent. But that's going to be a matter. That's just simply going to be a matter of strategy in different contexts and stuff. And I'm not interested in going into too much detail on like gradualism versus revolution tonight.
So, okay. So then, would you say mutualism is just when cooperatives are the dominant force? Like, could we still have private firms?
I'd say mutualism would be, yeah, as in a mutual society would be defined by that. But if you to ask me how a society would look like based on my principles, would be there wouldn't be absentee property, or there would be a severe reduction in absentee property. So I'd probably say that a firm with more than 3 people in it would be cooperativized.
Okay, would that be like? Because I don't necessarily see anything wrong with cooperatives being the dominant form of enterprise. But I guess my issue is just only making it as policy that it must be that way.
Ah, it's interesting. So, okay. The thing with I mean, are you assuming that I'm wanting the government to ban private ownership?
Yeah, in the scenario like that, yes.
How can you ban private ownership? How can you ban a property right?
You probably just don't enforce it, is what I would imagine.
Yeah, you don't enforce it, right? There's a difference between banning something and not enforcing it. So, let's say, for example, a person can technically sign a contract to say, right, I am now your slave, right? The government won't enforce that new property right. I don't have a property claim over someone, even though they signed the contract, I've transferred the money and all the rest of it. The property claim will still be invalid because, but they haven't criminalized me. It's only until I start trying to enforce that property right on my own part by kidnapping the guy, beating him into submission, blah blah blah, and the government will react to it, right?
So I don't really see an issue with the state enforcing property rights then. But I would also like to add. Yeah, I would also like to add that depending on how you define cooperative, because I don't think cooperatives necessarily are anti-capitalist. I mean, I suppose if you want to stick strictly to who owns the means of production, I guess it's possible. But I can envision a society with, broadly cooperative that still has profit motive as well as private capital. You could have different forms of democratic ownership of a business. You could have maybe, I forget what they're called, employee stock ownership, or you could have employee board membership, and these would all still stay within the realm of capitalism. So if these are the forms of cooperative you're referring to, then yeah, I'm perfectly okay with it. Again, I just take issue with not enforcing sort of like property rights.
Yeah, that's fine. But I've dealt in videos I've dealt with definitions of capitalism, and I will concede that there is some use of the word capitalism, often used by libertarians, where if they apply that definition consistently, then I am myself pro-capitalist. However, there's just other definitions of capitalism which I prefer to use, and I think is most commonly used. Capitalism usually just means the economic system which we have now. I predict that a mutualist economy is going to be radically different to what we have now, and so I don't really call it capitalist. I call it anti-capitalist. But if you just say capitalism is just the free market with private ownership of private quote unquote private ownership and profit motives, then I'd say yeah, fine, that's capitalism. I'm a capitalist by your standards, okay, but I'm still advocating something which you disagree with, and that is the lack of enforcement of private property rights. So I think a label which distinguishes us is useful. That's why I say I'm a mutualist and you're pro-capitalist, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's fine. That's just semantics. So in terms of enforcing property rights, the burden of proof is actually on you because when it comes to authority, and as I said in my opening statement, property is an authority claim. A burden of justification has to be, well, I hope you'd agree with this. A burden of justification has to go on the person who's making a claim to authority over other people. So I have to put the question to you: is that why do you think property is justified?
Yeah, I actually agree with you. I think the onus would be on whoever is saying that there should be authority or there ought to be authority over somebody else. For me, the justification just lies in sort of it's the framework by which sort of the economic system exists currently, and I'm gonna say it's fundamental to the operation of the capitalist economy right now, and the idea sort of like when it comes to private property for like renting houses and all that. That's basically it. It's what keeps society stable right now. If you could, sort of say, if you could envision some society, and we could demonstrate somehow empirically that we wouldn't meet sort of like any issues with productivity or production to meet the needs of the population, then obviously that would be by definition, would be a better system, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, we can only do that once we have a nationwide experiment, really. And it'll have to occupy the same nation, by the way. Like, to say that mutualism works better in the United States than capitalism in the United States, we'd literally have to make the United States a capitalist nation. Sorry, a mutualist nation.
No, I think probably
bother to make that claim.
Probably once you have a mutualist experiment that's probably the size of like around a state, like at that point you could probably just go ahead and establish it nationwide. Like I don't think it has to be nationwide at all. You could probably even go smaller than that, or maybe you have multiple experiments around the world that sort of point towards how you could structure a mutual society.
Yeah, well, I'd probably say you could go even smaller. It goes down to the individual firm. Well, your justification.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Is that it seems to be property is justified, private property is justified, or absentee property is justified in order to maintain capitalism. But capitalism itself is whereby the institutions of private property are the dominant norm. So it's like, do you see how that's kind of circular?
No, because right now I think
it's justified to maintain property rights, because that's justified to maintain property rights.
No, it's I guess maybe, but for me it's more like it justifies it in the sense that I want an economic system that can produce certain outcomes. So in terms of like agency, well-being, safety, and right now property rights is important to that. But we do also have a democratic state. Well, at least in the U.S. I'm mainly referring to the U.S. Where if we were to exert enough popular influence, if you wanted to run those experiments, I believe you could. It would not be an issue. Because unless you would say that, in at least the United States, that politicians are not responsive to their voter base.
Yeah, they're not. I mean, that's just by the by, isn't it? So the status quo is desirable, is what you're saying.
Sorry, what?
The status quo is desirable, is what you're saying.
Yeah. It's like, so for example, just because let's say you have an airplane, right? And there were some faults with the airplane, and we needed to say fly 500 miles. If we didn't make it 500 miles, then you would die. Well, you would probably run some experiments on designs that you have currently. Maybe you can only fly maybe about 50 feet. You probably want to slowly build your way up to the 500 miles. Now, if somebody came in and they had a radically different idea, they might say, well, this is how we can get to those 500 miles. Now, it depends on sort of the urgency of the situation how radical you're willing to go, because when you tear down a system, you might make things worse. Things could end up worse. So that's why I prefer sort of like this more experimental, slow approach.
So I kind of agree here. So it seems like your main objectivism, your main objection to mutualism might be the threats that come along with revolution.
Threats of revolution, but also if you were to prescribe sort of like broadly forced cooperatives, there may be some issues concerning cooperatives. And I know there are some currently, specifically when it comes to sort of like barrier to entry, when you have a lot of people who maybe don't have the capital or to initially invest into a cooperative, or maybe what's another issue? I think another issue is with high barrier to entry would be that if you have people who come in, you're probably going to select out people for maybe, I guess, education, or maybe have money, because they're going to have equity inside your company, and you would be diluting sort of like the value of each individual share of every single co-op owner. But that would just be one issue. And also, it doesn't seem that cooperatives lend themselves well to other industries. So like they seem to be concentrated in certain industries. I forget which industry. I think like agricultural is one, but there may be other industries where they're not as effective. So that's why I wouldn't want to broadly sort of mandate cooperatives. I'd say, well, okay, are there any barriers to cooperatives right now? Currently, what are they? Are any of them unfair? Then let's sort of like, maybe we can try to have some incentives, see where cooperatives lay, where they go. But I wouldn't want to ban private firms.
Yeah, I can't. I'm not familiar with best policy on regarding cooperatives, and I assume you're not familiar on policies regarding the UK. So I wouldn't go down in that kind of discussion. Just out of convenience. But I would like to address a couple of those points about cooperatives. So barrier to entry. Well, in terms of not people being unwilling to put the capital together to create a cooperative, that's because people who have the money have all incentive to invest in a private firm where they are the owner, and they would rake in the majority of profits in a society whereby that kind of property right is not enforced, and people are necessarily going to have to do it with the cooperative model. The cooperative model is table. So,
hey, I think something's up with your mic.
So, oh, is it? Can you hear me now?
That's a lot better.
Hello. Right. Okay, I probably just moved it. So, without the capitalist option on the table, then the people with the money are going to invest in cooperatives at the end of the day. I think that's enough of an answer to do with the whole barrier to entry problem there. Maybe there are barriers to entry in terms of the law to the USA. Another barrier to entry would be a lack of education on cooperatives. I think people generally don't know what cooperatives are. And I'm not saying that's always due to propaganda and brainwashing. It's literally who the fuck knows what a cooperative is. Like if you went outside your door and you said, "Hey, do you know what a cooperative is? How it works?" They'd probably say no. just as a percentage, as an average. What else is there? Oh, in terms of the share devaluing. Well, the percentage of a share decreases, okay, but not necessarily the value of that share itself. So cooperatives will hire people if they think it is profitable to do so on the whole. So you bring someone in to try and make the pie bigger, so to speak. It's not a zero-sum game. It's very similar to like just how capitalism works today, as in a new company starting up isn't necessarily taking a slice of the pie and making everyone else's slice smaller. It's increasing the size of the pie, and everyone else's pieces, okay, maybe a little bit smaller, but the content of that slice is greater. It's the same thing with cooperatives and how they hire. It's why some cooperatives like Mondragon have managed to scale up to the size of like 75,000 employees. So that in terms of that, it's not too much of a problem. Cooperatives also like to merge and they like to what's the word? Confederalize, and that's generally how corporate expansion occurs. So you have a number of factories or a number of shops or a number of whatever starting off independently, and then they contact each other and they find out that it's best to merge, and then they work more effectively as non-competitors. That's why there's a movement called the One Big Co-op movement, where you're effectively looking at anarcho-collectivism growing out of some kind of mutualist movement, but that's another thing altogether.
Sure.
Remind me.
This is all. I'm sure there are ways to navigate through these sort of barrier to entries, but for me, it just ultimately there's certain structural issues with cooperatives that sort of lend to some kind of friction when it comes to starting enterprise and expanding it. And again, that's not necessarily too bad. It only becomes an issue when we're trying to mandate that. When you're sort of saying that now this is how everything must be the case. Because what I'm more concerned about is I do think cooperatives are good, but what I'm more concerned of is maintaining sort of broad health indicators, indicators of well-being, sort of the agency that I described earlier. That is what I'm concerned with. So if we were to say, let's say establish cooperatives, right, mandate cooperatives, and we were to lose like our ability to make music, well, I don't see why that would be preferable over a society where you have cooperatives and private firms and sort of like overall high labor mobility. I'm not sure what the advantage would be there.
For me to reject mutualism over that would be how would mutualism forbid someone from making music? Like, people have been able to make music in all kinds of different societies, and from fascist to communist to tribalist to anything. So it's
sure.
I know you just use that as an example, right?
Yeah.
But in terms
well, I can
of
explain.
go on.
I can explain. So obviously you can still make music, but what I mean is that there are certain productive capabilities that I would expect in a society for a society to have before it's you need to be able to feed your citizens and so on. You need to be able to produce materials such as like microphones, computers, and all these things, right? So I'm essentially saying that if you were to establish a mutual society and mandate cooperatives, well, I don't know why I would prefer that over a society where I can choose to work in a cooperative or a private firm, but maybe we can manufacture more computers to have fun with.
Yeah, so I'd say I know nothing about cooperatives that prevents those things from occurring.
Well, it's just about the allocation of capital and productivity, because we don't really see cooperatives.
We can know this a priori.
What do you mean?
A priori. So we can't, just by looking at microeconomics, we know that if this business model can work and it works in an industrial market, then we know that there's no reason why these things can't be done under a cooperative economy.
Oh, sure. I'm not saying that it's necessarily the case that mandated cooperatives cannot achieve this. All I'm saying is that we don't know. So I don't know why I would want to just go ahead and mandate cooperatives when we can sort of like do something that doesn't really do away with capitalism and just incentivize cooperatives. And then if they are as efficient as sort of everyone says it is, then they'll just take over as the dominant form of firm.
Yeah, and even if those problems did arise, right? Say that we discovered through experimenting with useful property norms that in certain areas you needed to have a good degree of absentee property, and that absentee property will end up being enforced. An example of this, I think, would be car hiring or lodging. So I want to go on holiday to Florida. To be able to travel around Florida adequately, I'll need to hire a car. Now, if we got rid of absentee property in that sector, then I can't hire a car, so I'd have to buy a new car, and that sounds pretty annoying. So in that respect, absentee property would still function in that sector, though because because that kind of model won't be the dominant form of what's the word, of how institutions are run in the market. I wouldn't call that now it's a capitalist economy. I'd still say it's operating under a mutualist society.
Yeah, like I said, my only issue is with
I'm just saying that. I'm just saying that that kind of concession can be made within the development of mutualism itself.
Yeah, sure. Like if mutualism were to be established this way, let's say if all we do is we incentivize cooperatives, we increase education, we sort of have because obviously I support a what's called welfare state. We have a broad welfare state, and then people just sort of choose to organize themselves in such a way that makes cooperatives a mandate. Sorry, not mandate, but the predominant sort of firm. Then I'm okay with that. I'm not sure why anybody would object to this. I don't even think most capitalists would object to this.
Yeah, the capitalists won't object to that. They'll just object to the lack of enforcement of their private property claims. So
sure, and like I said, as long as if you wanted to establish sort of like these systems without a private property, I think there is a path to do so experimentally if you wanted to.
So I suppose I've been tickling the meat and potatoes for quite a while, and I'll probably just dive into the soup. So the reason why I'm pro cooperative property rights is because I'm an egoist, right? So as far as I'm concerned, everything regarding ethics and everything regarding politics needs to be, in order for me to support it, needs to be in line with my self-interest. Now, if you have a system whereby I can realistically, percentually, only really work for a capitalist firm, whereby I'm working under the command of a boss, then it's better off that I work in a firm where I have a joint stake in the ownership of it. I have some kind of democratic say on how that is worked. Cooperatives usually are very good for the workers themselves. As I said before, like worker cooperatives, on average, report back superior numbers in terms of like worker happiness and worker productivity, workers' wages, workers' job security, things like that. In 2008 crash, cooperatives were almost unaffected by it, whereas other people in normal private firms were just sacked. So another reason for that would be another thing I'd say is like if you had a small business, and small businesses are sometimes the worst ones to work at, but a small business like one of the fucking ones you see on Gordon Ramsay's Hell's Kitchen, not Hell's Kitchen, Kitchen Nightmares. There's a USA version. I think you might have seen it. What's always happens is we got this chef who's inherited this restaurant from the family. Every single person there knows he's a fucking idiot. He doesn't know what he's doing. All of his bad decision makings is just driving everyone down. I'm sat there thinking, well, why can't they appropriate that business? Why can't they just take it off him? Why can't they just vote him out? Have him as like just a normal cook, and then democratically elect another manager. It is within their interest to be able to do that. So, and it's from this kind of bringing it back to the individual self-interest or the working class interests of the working class. This kind of replacement of property norms becomes the ideal goal. Does that make sense?
I guess no, I understand. My issue with sort of ideal goals is that, well, I mean, you can make an ideal goal be anything. You can imagine any kind of economic system in your mind, and ideally it'll work, of course, right? But like, so for your Hell's Kitchen example, I think is a really good example because I think you're right. If sort of everybody has to work, I don't even think in the most communist society people don't work. Work is just like a fact of
I
life.
agree.
So people have to work. So then the question is, okay, so people don't have a choice to work. We probably want them to have enough choice. And when it comes to a capitalist system with private firms, that's why I think the sort of the concept of labor markets and having enough labor mobility is very important. Obviously, society right now doesn't meet the requirements that I think are important for labor mobility. So, for example, we probably need better welfare systems. People need to feel like they can quit a job and then go to another one without losing health insurance. So you probably need some sort of healthcare system that's free, or at least free at the point of service. Um, so yeah, I just think by focusing on labor mobility, you can sort of solve the issue of people not being able to leave where they don't want to work. Because people may still not want to work at a certain cooperative. It would be better if they just had the choice to choose the best cooperative for them. And as far as sort of like people getting treated at work, yeah, that's also why I support increased labor mobility and organizations through like unions, employee stock ownership, and so on. Even cooperatives are probably a good way to do it. There's lots of different ways to do it without dismantling capitalism. Um, and then you could also just establish workers' rights. We've been able to get a long way, at least in the United States, by establishing some sort of labor rights.
Yeah, like as I call it, duct tape. I imagine it as a pretty faulty system, faulty structure, and the government just running around applying duct tape every time like a leak comes out of it. That's basically how I see state intervention. So there's a few problems with state intervention as opposed to the cooperative movement. If you own a cooperative, then and there's a problem in the workplace, then it's because there's a convergence of interest between owners and employees. As in the owners are the employees, then that problem can be easily addressed. So like, we feel like we're not being paid adequately. Well, okay, can we afford to pay ourselves a bit more? If we can, then let's do so. They immediately set all the different what's the fucking word? Conditions of work. They improve the conditions of work themselves rather than hoping that their favourite party in the next election can maybe get past a certain policy through government. I mean, you accepted earlier that politicians in the United States don't really represent the interests of the masses. They, whether or not a policy is
I wouldn't
preferred or
agree with
not
that
preferred.
necessarily.
Well, there's a study done that said public attraction towards one policy or another had no impact on the likelihood on whether or not that policy would be passed. So relying on liberal democracy to fix the problems in the workplace seems absurd to me, when the alternative is to have the workers just be able to democratically address the problem themselves, than having to appeal to some giant fucking government to add another page to its long list of regulations to fix the problems of a capitalist system which it enforces.
Yeah, I think I understand what you're saying, and I would say that, at least I'm only going to speak for the American example because I'm an American. I don't really understand. I don't really know other systems.
That's fair, yeah.
But
Well,
when you're talking about mass appeal, the system doesn't really. It's not really designed to sort of like. You don't have individual senators apply sort of like their policy based off of mass appeal throughout the state. They only represent their voter base. So like a voter base could, for one senator, might be 25% of a population in a city in Wisconsin. So, is the study, as far as I understand, is this study probably applies broadly to policy made at the national level, which is usually negotiated by the senators. And you have a lot of conflicting different interests there. But when it comes to, do they represent their voter base? Yeah, they definitely do. They definitely do represent their voter base. Now,
yeah, it sounds like a lot of layers of bureaucracy just to address labor disputes. And unions, again, you mentioned unions. Like, unions exist and they go on strike, and that causes quite a lot of problems simply because there's a conflict of interest between employers and employees. That's addressed immediately by the cooperative movement.
No, yeah, I understand. Yeah, like there's definitely some benefits to cooperatives, and that would be one benefit. But again, what I'm saying is that I think there's also a certain sort of like quality of life that I think an economic system should be able to provide, and that's what I want to maintain.
Yeah, well, cooperatives provide better quality of life for the workers and members of cooperatives than employees of private firms on average.
Oh, well, and I mean specifically when it comes to like capital allocation and resource allocation.
Well, yeah, even so, I mean, the problem is we keep going back to this. We've gone full circle, but it just seemed to me that I can't possibly convince you of mutualism until, I don't know, your government runs an experiment of mutualist anarchy to see if it is a necessary institution. And I don't think I can ever meet that standard, which is kind of and I don't think any system can, any alternative system to the one we have today, can ever meet that standard.
Well, sure you can. You would have to convince the voter base to vote for politicians who would represent sort of like mutualist or who would push for that kind of policy. Like that's what you have to do.
I'd have to convince the voter base to be pro-mutualist in order to run. I don't understand.
Well, because at least in America, if you want the state to do anything or to pass policy, what you need to do is you need to convince the voter base, because they're the ones who elect politicians into power, and the politicians into power tend to reflect the interests of their voter base.
You said that the experiment will need to be state size or maybe small, city size. Well, you've got to convince the people in that city to be experimented on, haven't you? And they will have to find mutualism appealing in the first place to even try the experiment.
Well, they would have to voluntarily choose to be experimented on. Like, you probably have to establish some sort of safety net, which is why it'd be good to not have it sort of ran nationwide, because you could have maybe, like again, in the American system, you would have federal government support to be able to mitigate any disaster caused by mandating cooperatives within a city. You could, it provides.
Even with safety nets, like that's you've got to convince a lot of people in New York or New York State just to go through the hassle of a mutualist experiment.
Well, you got to convince them. Right? You got to convince them to overthrow capitalism, don't you? Like, I feel like convincing them to do my thing is a lot easier than just overthrowing all of capitalism.
Not really, but no, because you'll have to. I in both cases, I need to convince them that mutualism is at all appealing, right? If I convince people that mutualism is appealing, then they'll end up joining the cooperative sector rather than the private sector, rather than the public sector. And that is it. The cooperative sector is itself providing the experiment, and the experiment is only getting bigger. It's only I say snowballing. It's slowed down because of COVID. Everything's slowed down because of COVID, but it has been snowballing for the past 10 years.
Sure. So
at least in the UK, anyway.
So I don't think it's any more difficult to convince people of sort of my position than your position. I think your position is probably more of a difficult sell if you were to convince the population to sort of like, hey, we're not sure how this is going to work out, but we're going to do our best to make mutualism work. We're just going to have to mandate cooperatives entirely throughout the entire country. I think it's probably easier to convince maybe a city, a small city, a large city, or maybe even a state to say, hey, we can use federal funding to run sort of cooperative experiments here in Wisconsin or Wisconsin City. And if you guys vote for it, then we can do it.
On the contrary, it's more my means of convincing people is one individual at a time. Right? It's not. I'm not out to try and convince the country all in one go. I don't think that's going to work like that. I think it's going to be at least one at minimum or at maximum one workplace at a time, and that's what union co-ops are doing, or cooperative unions are doing. They are convincing employees to try out the cooperative experiment, and that's why the cooperative sector is currently snowballing. Whether or not I think that's going to be enough to implement mutualism across the board, I don't know. But I think there's decent enough reasons for employees to desire the cooperative model and work towards cooperativizing their own workplaces. Now, the revolution aspect only comes into it, or when I said before, I mentioned violent means. That only really comes into it if there's like some kind of enormous economic recession where there's a kind of chaos in the streets anyway. Where people think the status quo is no longer legitimate, and they end up just sort of taking their own workplaces by their own will, by force, whatever. Right.
Sure,
I'm also noticing the time.
All I'm saying is that
just for your sake.
That's fine. This is an interesting conversation. All I'm saying is that I don't think you can say that my position is any less feasible than yours. Is what I'm saying, and it seems like that's the criticism you're trying to levy upon me right now.
Well, I am. Okay, that's fair enough, and I am levying that criticism because I've got to convince the majority of New York State have mutualism be experimented upon them. Whereas what I would do if I was living in New York is trying to convince individual workplaces that the co-op model is more desirable than private model, and that's how gradualism. That's what gradualism is.
Oh yeah, that's another way.
And not
just
the co-op model, not just the co-op model, but also the anarchist model in general. I'm trying to convince people to join anarchist federations and stuff.
Also, just a super quick interjection. It's not a problem at my end, but you guys have been going for almost 50 minutes. Neolib, are you sure you're okay for time?
So the reason why I had to go was because I had a date, but I'm fine. Continue the conversation.
Okay, that's fine.
Had a date, cool. But dude, go on your date. Like, I'm not worth.
Did you like abandon your date for a Discord debate? Go on, say you did, please.
No.
Oh.
So what's the plan then? Like,
we can just continue for maybe like for another 10-20 minutes.
Right, okay, but don't jeopardize your date for this. It's not worth it, mate.
Nothing's in jeopardy. Don't worry.
Okay. Continue.
Oh shit! What was the last thing?
I've generally forgotten. SD, this is your fault.
Sorry, but I just thought he needed to keep track of the time. Well, it's 7:30, right? It's 7:30 UK time, so whatever, it's 7:30 for you, Neo. Do you want to go until, say, like, the next hour approaches?
Let's say 10 minutes. Let's say 10 minutes.
10 minutes. All right, that's fine. Cool.
I'd like to get some questions in as well, if that's possible.
I don't think we have... Oh, you mean from, like, just yourself, not the audience?
The audience.
Well,
if that's a...
don't think there are any. I mean, Andy was in here, but he's dipped out. Yeah. Anyway, just carry on. Whatever.
Anyways, fair enough. So my point was, my goal is my goal is merely to convince as many workplaces as possible, one at a time, and let mutualism snowball. Yours was to convince New York to be experimented on. I think convincing New York to be experimented on is probably a lot more difficult than my strategy.
I think both. I would want to see both strategies. Because if people want to organize themselves into cooperatives, there's nothing wrong with that. And if you can convince people to do so, that's fine. That's perfectly fine. That I would consider that part of the experiment. I was just giving sort of like a state-based solution because that's. I mean, we're assuming that. Yeah, I guess I was just thinking state-wise, but yeah, I like your view too.
Yeah.
I mean,
So
again, it's just the mandates. This is the mandates that I want.
yeah, the mandates will. Let's say mandates. The lack of willingness to enforce private property was only going to come as anarchist federations begin to eclipse state power. So a power shift from the state to these anarchist federations will mean that these federations themselves don't really recognize. Federations already exist. They themselves don't recognize private ownership. Once they begin to eclipse the government's influence, and I might be talking about a very fantasy world now, but once they begin to eclipse that government influence, like we did in Catalonia, then private property will no longer be enforced. It's not a case of a federation goes to the government and says, right, I want you to stop enforcing property, and then the government says, yes, okay, snaps their fingers. It's a case of people willingly willingly following the laws provided by these federations, and the enforcement of private property just not being one of them.
I mean, if it works out that way, and you can sort of maintain productivity and maintain the quality of life that I would consider good, then like I think almost anybody would support that. I think the issue comes in sort of like my main issue is when you make claims as that this is absolutely the case.
Such as
sort of like your statement about pragmatism when it comes to mutualism.
I'll need to go back over our original comments or original conversation. But if I was to say if I was to ever use the word pragmatism, I don't call myself a pragmatist. If I was ever to use the word pragmatism, I would be usually critiquing anarcho-communists, because every time we see a anarcho-communist society be implemented at all, ever, anywhere, literally anywhere, the market just has a habit of reappearing, and things be done on a mutualist level. So that's why I'd probably say mutualism then is more. I might be talking absolute shit. I might have used the word pragmatism in a completely different context.
Okay, well, okay. Do you still think my position is paradoxical?
Bat, you're cutting out, dude.
Because it would.
ThoughtBat, you're cutting out. Like, sorry to interject, but we couldn't hear you.
Sorry, my mic probably just left me.
You're back.
I'm back. Lovely. So it's paradoxical because if we were to teleport ourselves back to the beginnings of the American Revolution, the system which you advocate today is one that you'd have to be against back then. Like you'd be in favour of the British monarchy, because that is the thing that works. You know it works, it exists. You'd also be pro-slavery. I mean, I'm not, because you know that slavery works. It manages to feed people. It manages to do this and the other. You don't know what the consequences of liberating the slaves would be, and you don't know what the consequences of liberal democracy would be in the United States. So you would have no grounds to support the American Revolution.
Yeah, you wouldn't know for sure, but you could make reasonable extrapolations. What I was more concerned with about the extrapolations you were making with mutualism was that because cooperatives do so right now, that therefore we know for sure that cooperatives can take over every industry and every sector. That is the issue that I have with that extrapolation.
That was the capitalist argument. That was the capitalist argument from the get-go.
What do you mean?
Well, the liberals the early liberals like John Locke and Adam Smith and that kind of group. I know there's about 200 years between those two, but the early liberals saw capitalism developing within the shell of the old system, gradually developing, and they just pointed to capitalism and say, look, the capitalist mode of production is pretty good where it exists, and in the individual pockets it exists. Let's support that become the dominant mode of production over feudalism, and that's basically what happened. Capitalism just grew and grew and grew and grew until it got to the point where the rule of the monarchy was just an inconvenience to everybody. And that made the American and French revolutions both justified and possible.
Yeah, that sounds like my position. I'm not sure what you mean, because I do think we should look at other examples and then sort of emulate the good things and understand the bad things.
Wait,
I'm not sure how I would be.
It's not,
yeah.
No, because it's not your position. Because what I'm doing is I'm pointing to the cooperative sector and saying, hey, that's good. It's a growing sector within capitalism. Just like the capitalists pointed at the pockets of capitalism, as in the individual capitalist firms, which were relatively small compared to what they're about to become, which is a growing sector within feudalism. And they just pointed to that and say, hey, wouldn't it be great if they were the norm? They weren't the norm at the time, but just saying, hey, wouldn't it be great if they were the norm? And that's basically what Adam Smith did.
If you're saying wouldn't it be great if they were the norm, then yeah, of course I would agree with that. What I would disagree with is that by abolishing property rights, we would be able to maintain the sort of the quality of life and the productivity, as well as capital and resource allocation. That is what I would disagree with. But yeah, of course, you can point at something and say that was great. Yeah.
That's what I do with mutualism right now.
Yeah, that's fine. Again, my issue is mainly with claims about how productive a country would be and what kind of life an economic system would provide to its to, I guess you could say, to the agents that participate in it.
The onus would have to be on you to say that private property is itself the driving force of that kind of production. I don't think it is. I think it's just division of labour, which is not married to private property, and it's the industrialization which accompanies the division of labour that led to what we have now.
When it comes to
the nice cushy living standards we have now.
Well, when it comes to allocating resources right now, yeah, private capital is very important. It's how you have the flexibility to raise capital to start an enterprise. Is the fact that you do have private capital, the fact that somebody can lend you money, essentially invest in a company, and then with the promise of receiving some money later. That is like a very important part when it comes to capital investment, or especially when you start like new enterprise.
We can have that in mutualism, like we have, as in the mutual bank.
But
members of the bank. Members of the bank.
You're talking about so now banks will be in control of every form of investment, is what you're saying.
Already are. But
you
rather than these banks be privately owned, they become owned by the members. I'm not against investments and interest rates.
Well, I don't care who owns the bank. I'm just more concerned with abolishing private capital. Is what I'm. Or again, not.
Well, you do care who. Hang on, you do care who owns a bank, because about abolishing. I'm not in favour of abolishing capital. I'm in favour of abolishing private ownership of the capital. So rather than the bank be owned by private owners, it's owned by the members, all the customers of the bank.
Okay, I mean, if there are banks that operate that way and it leads to great outcomes, then I mean that's great. I don't see anything wrong with it.
Oh, okay, I think I agree.
This seems like a really good time, because like that was almost another 10 minutes, and I think Neo, that's what you had left, right? Do you want to do a quick Q&A before we shut off the recording?
Sure.
Okay.
Yes, it's up to Neo.
Yeah, well, I mean, both of you. So, right, if anybody in the room has a question and you happen to be a mod, you can just ask it in VC anyway, because obviously you can unmute yourselves. If anybody who is not a mod wants to ask a question, you can request to be unmuted. We're in VC text. That's the channel that I'm following for this. I think. Okay. Mr. Coles wants to be unmuted, so yes, of course he can. I think somebody already did it. Mr. Coles, you should be on the mic.
Okay, yeah. A quick question I want to ask the neoliberal, because I know you said that like you wanted to keep the system in place because it facilitates your values the most, but like what exactly is those values? Is it like autonomy or something?
Um, well, so I do value agency, and by agency, I guess the best way to describe it would be people being able to choose what's best for themselves. That'd be one of my values. Another value is so like well-being, safety, health, creative expression, stuff like that. So like, and the reason why I separate these from agency is because like, if you were to say propose an economic system where you had maximal agency, where everybody could choose what's best for themselves, however, it was in the middle of a debt, or let's just say for whatever reason, resource allocation was such that half the population was constantly starving. Well, I would be okay sacrificing some of the agency in return for a mode of economic system that could provide more well-being to the citizens, which would be nobody starving.
Okay, that's interesting. I'm fine then.
Do you want to respond to it? It's okay to have a quick back and forth about a question. That's not an issue.
Okay, yeah, okay. I guess my only follow up would be like, okay, then how do you determine that like the existing system is best for this and not feudalism, not socialism, not any other economic system?
Oh, I think that's you basically can't know. Like you can never know what is the best system or which systems don't actually work. You just sort of like use the information you have at hand and slowly build your way, improving what you've got. And then if you want to do something that's radically different, you probably want to run experiments, right?
Even
Like the
though
same
no
idea.
system before has ever ran experiments that proved itself worthy before it existed, any system
Yeah.
that now comes after has to prove itself worthy.
So just because things were done a certain way in the past doesn't mean that they should continue to be that way.
I mean, well, I'm saying the opposite. That it would seem kind of odd if you were saying that, like, well, for them to justify its existence, it needs this. Although for the existing system, it did not need that justification.
Sure, I would say in order to make statements about reality in the past, you didn't need the scientific method. But now, yes, I think we should sort of enforce that method when it comes for people making statements about what is.
And economic systems, you think, can be tested like a scientific method?
It would be very difficult because economics is not like there's so many human behavior is just extremely difficult. But yes, if you want to build systems or institutions that are going to affect humans, you probably want to understand how those institutions affect humans like reliably and at a broad scale. Yes, like this is how like if you were even if you're running a company before you started like a new department, you want to try something different. You probably want to start small and then build your way up.
Okay.
Cool. So, like, the reason that it's cool to have a little bit of a back and forth on each question is because there's only one more question, and that's from Conan. Like, Conan, is that like? Do you want to ask it yourself, or do you want me to read it out? Like, what's the deal?
No, I did not ask any questions. I just noted that there were
Oh,
republics
sorry,
before.
I misread what you said. I thought you said will republics, but you said well. So my bad. So yeah, do you have like any closing remarks between ThoughtBat and Neolib? Like just a quick one, like maybe 60 seconds each.
Yeah, vegetable vindaloo is fucking disgusting.
Okay, so my last statement
Probably
is
agree.
I don't know what vegetable vindaloo is.
It's vegetables in like a fairly warm curry sauce, I think. But, Neo, you wanna like any closing remarks? It's not a big deal, but if you want to.
No, I don't have any.
Okay, cool.
Yeah,
Well, with oh, you wanna go? ThoughtBat?
yeah. So just regards to the whole like, oh, this is all compatible with capitalism. Remark. Well, okay, maybe by your definition, I'm a capitalist. And maybe one day in the future I'll be looking at the way of things, and I'll say, capitalism is dead. Long live capitalism. That's it.
All right. Well, with that, thanks both.
Okay, I do have one last thing.
Yeah. If you
Sorry.
want, yeah, no, it's fine. It's fine. Go.
Yeah. So I still think that after this conversation, I don't think I was it was reasonably proven that my position is paradoxical.
So we can call this part one, right? Because all I'm really interested in doing is stopping the recording so that it doesn't go on for too long. You can talk as long as you fucking want. It's fine. But I'll stop the recording. Well, actually, I'm gonna stop it roughly now, and we'll call this part one when I upload it. And if you guys want to have a part two, you are of course more than welcome anytime either of you want to do it.